So good day, friends. This is Dr. Bob Hamilton, and you have tuned in today to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. So today, I have a great guest, but before I introduce my guest, I want to say thank you to all of you for tuning in today. It means a lot to me. I know that you are busy people. You're chasing kids and grandkids, and the fact that you make time to tune into the show warms my heart. So thank you for being here. And I promise you today, you're going to be very happy because the person we're going to talk to, whose name is Dr. Laurie Santos, she is a specialist in happiness. In fact, she teaches a course at Yale University. By the way, I think one of the most popular courses in the entire university there at Yale, entitled, it is called The Psychology of the Good Life. Did I get that right, Laurie?
Psychology and the Good Life. Yeah.
Psychology of the Good Life. Okay. I have too many notes here. Psychology of the Good Life. And she is a professor back there at Yale. She is the Chandrika and Ranjan Tandon Professor of Psychology at Yale University. Dr. Laurie Santos, it's such a pleasure to welcome you to the Hamilton Review.
Thanks for having me on the show.
So listen, you have been doing this happiness thing for quite a while, but before we get to the topic of happiness and how we become happy and how we avoid sadness, I suppose, tell us a little bit about yourself. Maybe scroll back a little bit, if you would, into your background. Tell us a little bit about your life, and tell us why you got into the business of happiness.
Yeah. So I grew up in New Bedford, Massachusetts. It's a city in Moby Dick. It's kind of an, old whaling town. Now more of like a working class town. Went to big urban public high school and was always interested in psychology. So I got a chance to head to college to study psychology and really just got hooked. For a while, I was really interested in the origins of cognition. So where do our cognitive abilities come from? Something I know you think about a lot on this in this show, thinking about kids and so on. But in just the last couple years, I started getting into the science of happiness. And that started when I took a new role on campus. I've been teaching at Yale for, over 20 years now, but in the last 5 years, I took on this new role where I became what's called the head of college. And so heads of college are faculty members who live on campus with students. And so I got a different glimpse of student life, maybe more close than sort of sitting, at the front of the classroom with all the students in the lecture hall. I was really eating with students in the dining hall and sort of seeing them on campus. And honestly, I didn't like what I was seeing. I was seeing this college student mental health crisis, where right now, nationally, more than 40% of college students report being too depressed to function each day. More than two-thirds of college students self-report being overwhelmingly anxious. And more than 1 in 10 students has seriously considered suicide in the last 6 months, right? This is not just at Yale. This is what's happening nationally. And so I was just seeing that in my community. And, I was devastated. I was like a benevolent aunt to this whole community of students who I was living with. And I just really wanted to do something to help them. And so this class, Psychology and the Good Life, came out of that. I was realizing that my field of psychology has all kinds of strategies you can use to feel less depressed, to feel less stressed, to feel less burned out. And I was realizing that my field wasn't doing such a hot job of sharing all these strategies with the people that needed them. And so I developed this new class, thinking, 30 or so students would take it. I didn't expect over 1,000 students to enroll the first time it was offered. We had a quarter of the entire Yale student body trying to take the class. And so, yeah, so that was
Do
my
you
my
meet
origin story.
you meet on the football field? Is that where you
Well, that
guys
was the
have?
joke. It was, it started in January, so it was going to be a little cold. In fact, we met in a concert hall because that was the only place other than the football field where everyone would fit.
So you actually had 1,000 students in your class.
Yeah, 1,200 the first time we taught it. Yeah, it was a,
I
mild logistical nightmare. But I mean, honestly, it taught something interesting. I think it shows that our young people don't like this culture of feeling so depressed and anxious. And I think they really wanted some evidence-based solutions for what they could do to feel better.
I mean that should also be a message to the faculty, to the administration about me. Hey, listen, the kids who are enrolled in our college are dealing with some deep things here.
Yeah.
Shocking. That's shocking. Well, it also, I think, probably speaks to you as a person too, Laurie. Obviously, something was they obviously knew you. You were living on campus, so bravo. That's really
Thank you.
incredible. Um, So happiness is a problem. I mean, there are a lot, is you look at people and I think that we see the, social media certainly they kind of scrub up your social medias to look like you're always happy. People do that. And obviously we kind of tended to look on these Instagrams or whatever it is, Facebook. And I think that people do compare themselves to other people and say they seem to be happier than me. I think that's a common phenomenon in human beings. But let me just ask you a question, and this is a basic question. How would you maybe clinically define happiness? What does that
Hmm.
mean to you? And
Yeah. Well, I think there's lots of ways, we could talk about it. I often joke with the students, we could spend the whole class on just defining happiness. But here's how social scientists tend to think about it. People think of happiness as having these two parts. It's being happy in your life and it's being happy with your life. So the idea of being happy in your life is the idea that you have a decent ratio of positive to negative emotions. Doesn't mean no negative emotions, but you want the laughter and the joy and the pleasure to kind of outweigh the sadness and the frustration and the anxiety, right? That's kind of being happy in your life. But there's a second part, which is being happy with your life. That's how you think your life is going. That's your answer to the question, all things considered, how satisfied am I with my life? And the idea for psychologists is that if you think your life is going well and you feel like it's going well, kind of in the trenches of your life, then we'd say that you're pretty happy. It's what researchers often call the cognitive and affective parts of happiness, the kind of thinking parts and the feeling parts. We want to boost both of those up.
so that's what it is. And so, how many people, I mean, when you look around, you talk to people, how many people are happy? I mean, your observation, with happiness, I mean, you're dealing with this all the time. You're talking to people all about it all the time. Are people happy or are people not happy? I mean, it seems like I was just maybe kind of back up a little bit. There's a lot of polarization in our world today, and you know that. Um, and it seems like there's a lot of unhappiness
Hmm.
just in the culture in general. That sense of positivity and hopefulness and everything seems to be down a little bit.
Yeah.
There's a lot of uncertainty, I think, in the culture right now. And do you think, I mean, first of all, I guess, how much does outer things, the things, I mean, look, there are things that go on within us. We have health issues, we have money issues, we have other, how much does the culture affect us personally in terms of our happiness? Like, I mean, political issues, other issues going on, international issues. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
thinking right now in the last 24 hours, I think about all the things that have happened internationally.
Hmm.
If you read the newspaper, a lot of stuff can make you unhappy. How
Yeah.
much is that? How do we, first of all, how much of that affects us? And number two, how can we overcome that?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of it affects us. I mean, one of the ways we know that is there's a long-standing research study that's run through the Gallup organization called the World Happiness Report. So this is something you probably see, every March or so, where they list the different countries and their happiness levels, and they say, "What's the happiest country out there?" Right? And so, if you look at the United States, what you find is that over time, the United States has begun tanking in terms of its happiness, even in just the last few years. And this year in 2025 was the first year that the United States was fully out of the top 20, the first year that, we didn't even make the top 20 cut. And I
Wow.
think that's
Well,
that's telling you that, happiness, particularly for us, is going down. That also tells us that the culture kind of matters a lot. And interestingly, there was a funny effect in the World Happiness Report this year where a lot of English speaking countries went down in their happiness. Canada was an interesting case in point. If you looked at the parts of Canada, the provinces that speak English, they, like the United States, kind of tanked in their happiness. But if you look at the provinces that tended to speak French, they didn't drop as much, which was kind of interesting. But I
well,
think
they have
the
better, they have better food and wine.
yeah, they have all the
Right?
poutine to protect them. No, but I think that the interpretation was that, a lot of the negative news, a lot of the negative social media, all the stuff we see on TikTok and so on, much of that is in English. And so the idea is there's something in the English speaking world that's kind of messing us up. And so, Yeah, I think, the hints from that study are that things like political polarization, all the things we're seeing around the world are having a negative effect. And then the bigger question you asked is, what can we do about it? Because I think that's a surprising thing that we don't often realize, which is that we have a lot more control over our happiness than we think. We think it's usually due to circumstances, but circumstances tend not to have as long-lasting effect on our happiness as we think. It tends to be more our behaviors and our mindsets. Those are the things that affect our happiness most. And the good news is that those are the things that with some effort we can control.
So let's dig into that. Can you dig? What are you talking about when you say mindsets and things that you're doing? So can you maybe elucidate a couple of ideas on that?
Yeah, so one of the big behaviors that we know improves happiness is getting a little bit more social connection. Pretty much every available study of happy people suggests that happy people are more social. They spend more time with other people and they prioritize time with their friends and family members. I think this is one of the reasons, incidentally, that if you look at reports, parents are reporting being less happy over time as well. The former Surgeon General Vivek Murthy just did a big report called Parents Under Pressure, where he talked about the kinds of stresses and unhappiness that parents are facing. And one of the big things he noticed is that families and parents in particular are feeling more lonely than ever, right? And so just missing out on that social connection, not having time for it, that can be a big hit on happiness. But of course, you can become a little bit more social. You can reach out to friends, you can call a buddy, you can take a walk with, a work colleague. There are ways we can build it up, but that's a behavior that we know really impacts happiness. Another one is just doing nice things for other people, becoming a little bit more other oriented. So, controlled for income, people who tend to give more money to charity tend to be happier than those that don't, even if at the same salary level. People who volunteer and do nice things for others wind up being happy. And even if you kind of do experiments where you force people to do nice stuff for others, they wind up feeling a little bit happier. So those are just some of the behaviors we know matter for happiness. In terms of mindsets, the idea is that it's, what did Shakespeare say? Nothing is good or bad, but thinking makes it so, right? A lot of our thinking makes our happiness or unhappiness so. We can have, the typical bias that people grow up with, which is a kind of negativity bias where your brain naturally latches on to all the stuff that's bad. Or we can work to develop a mindset of gratitude, right? Noticing the little blessings around us. And studies show that you can work on that, right? Simply by scribbling down 3 to 5 things you feel grateful for every night, you can start to build up this sort of gratitude muscle, and that winds up having a corresponding increase in your happiness and your satisfaction with life. Another mindset we can engage in is a mindset of presence, right? Just kind of being mindful and noticing the things around us. Too often we wind up mind wandering or kind of locked to our phones where we're just not noticing the good things. But just this act of getting grounded and feeling a little bit more present, whether that's through practices like meditation or prayer or just kind of savoring and noticing the environment around you, studies show that that can boost our happiness too. And then a final one that I think
Yeah.
is really important mindset that parents should kind of pick up on is a mindset of what's called self-compassion. All too often parents are very self-critical, right? Beat themselves up, lots of comparison. I'm not doing good enough. In that report by the former Surgeon General Vivek Murthy, he talked a lot about parents expressing guilt. Like that was the emotion he saw the most often in their surveys, guilt over not doing enough, kind of
Yeah.
beating yourself up because you're not doing enough. But if we engage in a mindset of self compassion where you say, look, all parents feel like they're not doing enough. It's a hard time to be a parent right now. What can I do to take something off my plate? How can I be kind to myself? That kind of mindset studies show can not only make you perform better as a parent and beyond, but it can also make you feel a little happier.
Yeah, I think that all of these things you did not mention physical activity.
That would
Is
have
that
been
something? Yeah,
definitely, definitely. Both physical activity and I think another one that we know parents need more of is sleep too, right? These practices that we know affect our physical health are also really important for our mental health. And exercise is a big one. One meta-analysis, this study of studies found that a half hour of cardio was as effective as taking an antidepressant medication for reducing symptoms of depression, right? So
yeah,
we again, I think forget how much our bodies are connected to our minds.
yeah. No, absolutely. One of the things that I deal with all the time is new mommies who have a baby and they're beat. They're really
Hmm.
beat. And I applaud the fathers who bring in a nanny, for example, or a night nurse who can actually watch the baby for a couple hours so mommies can get a a good block of sleep at night. Sleep is so critical, and I'm kind of coming to that a little bit late in my life, Laurie. I have to
Mhm.
say, is that doctors famously, we have a tendency to deny ourselves sleep. Certainly,
Mhm.
when we're doing our training, we can be up all night, up for 36 hours, and think we're doing well. We're not doing well. We get weird. We get paranoid, and but we kind of we did. I'm not sure so much anymore, but certainly when I was doing my training, we prided ourselves in the ability not to sleep. It was kind of inverse what it should have been, but anyway, I do think that sleep is a big one. What you talk a lot about gratefulness, and I think this is something, and I'm also kind of pushing us back maybe to the pediatric population. I know you're dealing with college kids. I still consider them kids, by the way.
Mhm.
But younger kids, this idea of gratefulness, I've talked about this on other shows, but how do you inculcate gratefulness into children? Is that
Yeah.
is that possible, or is that like impossible?
Yeah, I mean, I think you do it in two ways. One is you model it, right? Too often, I think we think of teaching as like, I'm going to tell my kid what to do. I'm going to tell them to, express gratitude. But I think if they just see their parents doing it and see the adults around them doing it, it kind of comes in naturally, right? And so I think expressing the things that you're grateful for, that you're savoring, can be really helpful. I think this is also a practice that you can do in social family situations, right? Historically, we've had the practice of saying grace before a meal. In some ways, it's a little bit gratitude, but just go around the table and say one thing that you're grateful for that happened today, right, is a great way to get kids talking. One of the reasons I love the advice of these mindsets and behaviors that I mentioned are good for happiness is that none of them are rocket science, right? Many of them are the kinds of things that you can be doing even as a young kid. And so I think building these kinds of habits in early is something that parents should really prioritize because, what we know about habits is the more you practice them, the easier it can be. So if you start doing this kind of thing when you're 5 or 6, expressing gratitude at a meal, it's just the kind of thing where you're training your brain to notice the good stuff early on.
Yeah. I agree. I think that I think it's good to we do say grace at our table, and I think it just gives you a moment to stop and kind of go, this food we have, this is a blessing.
Hmm.
This is you talk about little blessings in life. I want to get into that in a minute, but when you look at food, you kind of go, wow, we have, first of all, my wife is a great cook. I go, God, thank you for a wife who's such a good cook. And
Hmm.
I'm like the beneficiary, but it does cause you to say thank you. And I think that,
Yeah.
even, learning, I mean, listen, all my parents, when I give my kids in the office here a lollipop, most of my parents say, tell Dr. Hamilton, thank you. And the kids go, thank you. They
Yep.
barely,
Yep. Yep.
they sound like a frog, and they can't quite get it out. But I think that the parents are correct by saying, tell Dr. Hamilton, thank you. Okay. And they
Yep. Yep.
eventually, they cough it out because they want the lollipop.
Right.
Right.
Right. Right.
Um, so gratefulness, you can essentially model it, and I think there's a certain, I know this sounds maybe retrograde, but I think you can demand it to a degree too. You can say, no, you're not going to get this until you say thank you for it. Is that a wrong approach to teaching your children to be grateful?
I think better to maybe just show them through your own, behavior that, I think whenever we kind of penalize our kids or force them to do what they need to do, we get less out of them. I'm a big kind of believer in sort of modeling behaviors, especially if you look at what happens cross-culturally, you see a lot more of that where it's parents modeling rather than telling kids to do stuff. So to the extent that you can model it, even better.
Yeah. Okay. Good answer there. So you I'm thinking about parents in general. They do go through this whole guilt thing, and I think that there's a tendency, certainly my parents, young parents, all of us really look at our parenting, and we do feel guilty. We also feel like we're a little bit inadequate at what we're doing because parenting is overwhelming. What kind of recommendations would you make to the parents in my practice, or whoever, all the people who are listening to the show today, regarding how do you are you talking about being nice to yourself? Is this how you be partially do it, Or what kind of recommendations would you make?
Yeah, so a lot of this kind of form of self-talk comes from the work of Kristen Neff, who's a professor at UT Austin, who has this lovely book on self-compassion. So if you're a parent who's kind of struggling with guilt and so on, really encourage you to check it out. But she breaks the practice of self-compassion down into three steps. The first is what she calls mindfulness. You got to kind of call a spade, right? This is really hard right now. I'm struggling right now. I am frustrated with my kid right now. I'm looking on Instagram at some other parents and I'm feeling really ashamed. I'm feeling really beat up. You kind of notice mindfully what you're feeling, non judgmentally, but just say, hey, this is really tough right now. Step
Yeah,
number two is the hard one, where what Kristen F calls common humanity. And the idea is you just say, and this is a common human experience. All parents are going through this at some point or another. Every parent sometimes feels guilt. It makes sense in 2025, where there's so much happening in the world, that this is feeling even tougher than ever. Or it makes sense given that I'm having a hard week or that my kid is having a tough time, that I'm going through it. Common
yeah,
human experience. You kind of normalize it, right? But then step three is the kindness part, where you say, how would I respond to myself if it was my friend mentioning what they were going through? Like, how can I be kind to myself? Often, what can I take off my plate? Or, what do I know about what I might need right now? And the idea of sort of talking to yourself like you talk to a friend is where I think this idea of self-compassion differs from self-indulgence a little bit. Because, if you had a friend that was really screwing up in their parenting, doing something you were really worried about, I hope you wouldn't scream at them, but I hope you wouldn't let them off the hook either. You might say, "Hey, I'm concerned about you. I'm concerned about your family. Let's talk about what's going on. Let's come up with some ways to problem solve this," right? And that's the
yeah.
kind of attitude you're taking towards yourself. So it's not self-indulgence. It's not kind of letting yourself off your hook. It's just kind of noticing that things are really tough right now, and that makes sense. And what can you do to be kind to yourself?
Yeah, I think that those kind of personal conversations, I think we have those all the time. I certainly have those myself. I'm not always the kindest person to myself. I
Hmm.
sometimes beat myself up. I think that's kind of common. Um, I think that the you know looking that we do tend to look around and comparisons are always dangerous.
Hmm.
Um, you talk about this a lot in general in terms of comparing yourself to other people. How do we how do we get over that? What do you say to that?
Yeah. Well, I think one thing is to realize that we're constantly comparing, and also that we compare really badly. Like, our brains are prone to compare in ways that make us feel really terrible about ourselves. My favorite example of this comes from a study of Olympians, right? So, there's, I don't know, a swimming event or something, the gold medalist, silver medalist, and bronze medalist are on the stand having just won these medals. Gold medalist is pretty happy, but how is the silver medalist feeling? Well, psychologists go and they analyze the silver medalist facial expressions, and it's not so much that they're showing facial expressions of slightly less happiness. They're showing totally negative emotions, things like contempt, deep sadness, like anger, right? They're second best in the world, but they're showing all these emotions that show that they're having a really tough time up there. Why? Well, they're not thinking objectively, I'm the second best in the world. They're thinking, I lost, like relatively, I did bad. Like, there's one
Yeah,
reference point that they're comparing against, and it's the gold medalist, and they feel kind of terrible, right?
yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
but you might think the same thing would be going on with the bronze medalist. After all, they're objectively third. But it turns out if you analyze bronze medalists' expressions on the stand, what you find is they're showing real true happiness. Sometimes their expressions are even more happy than the gold medalist. Why? Well, what's the relevant comparison for the bronze medalist? Like, they weren't going to get gold. They were multiple seconds or points or whatever it was away from that. But their
Yeah,
comparison is like, I almost didn't even get up here. Like, their counterfactual is like,
right.
for 0.2 seconds, I'd be going home empty-handed, right? And so this I love as kind of a metaphor for how we should think about comparison. One is like, it seems to be pretty ballistic, right? We're not like thinking through really carefully who we should be comparing ourselves against. And whenever possible, if there's an obvious kind of comparison that makes us feel bad, usually that's what our brains latch onto. And so
Yeah,
part of it is noticing that, hey, I'm making a comparison. Is it making me feel bad? And then I think realizing that you can, with some effort and some intention, you can think more like the bronze medalist. I often joke that it's not that you're looking for the silver lining, you're looking for the bronze lining, and in terms of Olympians moves.
yeah,
But I think as all parents, we can do that, like if you're kind of thinking about your salary and kind of upset about somebody got a raise and you didn't, or a promotion you didn't, there's probably lots and lots of people, maybe millions of people out there in the world who are earning less than you or have less than you, right? It takes a little intention to notice that. But then all of a sudden, if you kind of frame things a little bit bigger, you can use that comparison to not feel so bad about yourself. But it's really hard to shut off. It's really just a feature of human nature, and so the key
Yeah.
is to notice how it's making you feel, that it's not that you're a bad parent. It's only like you're feeling like a bad parent because you're comparing yourself against some mommy influencer on Instagram who made the perfect cupcakes or something. You just need to take time to realize that that's not the only comparison out there.
Yeah. One of the things I like to do with my children, we've done this with all of my kids, is I've taken them abroad. I've taken them, as I share with you a little bit briefly. I do medical mission trips around the world. Been to Africa 26 times, and I've taken all of my children as they grew up. All six. We have six kids. I don't know if you knew that, Laurie. But
Mm,
anyway, we've taken all of them to Africa at different times and different places, Central America as well. And I do think that my part of what I'm trying to do is say, here's the real world. Here's another part of the world that we live in America. We live in Santa Monica, which is a great place to live. But there are other parts of the world where there's less abundance.
hmm.
And I don't know. Are you a traveler? Do you
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
as
Definitely
you
travel to lots of spots where you see, oh my gosh, we are incredibly lucky for things we take for granted all the time, right? Clean water that won't make
yeah.
you ill, right? A roof over your head that's stable, right? I mean, these are just things you probably, I'm guessing many listeners to your podcast have, and probably didn't take a moment today to be like, you know what, my life would be really bad if I just didn't have clean water that I could wash my dishes in and take a shower in and so on. But, that's not a given in life.
Not a given at all. Definitely when you get to the third world, is rare. Actually, it really is.
Hmm.
Um, so I'm all about that. You talk about you have mentioned when things happen, like a catastrophic event happens in the life of people. Um, this is something that I think that I think life happens to all of us. I think we all have issues, no one has a perfect life. We all know that we're human beings. We understand that travail kind of is there somewhere lurking on any given day. And people who actually do have accidents or whatever, they go through a calamity in their life. How are you happy in the midst of calamity?
Hmm. Well, this gets to some important work showing how bad we are at predicting the kinds of things that are going to make us happy and unhappy. And there's a really famous paper from a few decades ago that asks this for two things. One thing that we predict would make us very happy, which is winning the lottery, and something we would predict would make us feel really terrible for a long time, which is getting in a car accident, for example, and becoming paraplegic, right? Just losing the use of your, arms and
Yeah.
legs if you're
Yep.
lucky enough to have that right now. And so you ask lay people, how happy would you be if you won the lottery? People are like, oh my gosh, I'd be so happy. How happy would you be 6 months after winning the lottery? People say just as happy. Same thing with paraplegic, but the opposite way, right? How terrible would it be? Oh my gosh, it would be so terrible. I'd be so unhappy. 6 months later, I'd still be super unhappy. What do you find when it actually happens? So these researchers went out and they found actual lottery winners and actual people
Yep.
who'd been in terrible accidents, who've lost the use of their arm and legs. And what they find is that those people on the day of, they kind of report, that was a crappy day, to be fair. Like it wasn't as bad as you thought, but it was not an awesome Tuesday if you like, get in a terrible car accident, or it's a pretty good Tuesday if you win Powerball, right? That was an awesome day. But you come back 6 months later, and what you find is that statistically, your happiness was indistinguishable from before you won the lottery or before you became
Yeah.
paraplegic. It's not what our minds predict, but it's what the data show. And so this has been talked about as a bias in what's called our affective forecasting. We're really bad at forecasting how good and bad events are going to make us feel. And that's for
Yeah.
two reasons. One is that we get used to the good stuff, right? So if you get if you get a raise or you buy a new house, you get a new phone, buy a new outfit, whatever it is, have a new baby, right? At first, that's impacting you really highly, right? But then over time, you kind of just get used to it, right? It stops being as good as the first time.
Yeah.
I use the example of the first time your partner said, I love you, versus last Tuesday when they said, I love you, or the first time your kid said, mommy or daddy, versus, last Tuesday when they said mommy or daddy. Like it's not as impactful, it's not as good, right? You got
That's
used
right.
to it. But the key is that we forget that we get used to the good things, but we really forget that we get used to the bad stuff. We think if I had an accident and I lost the use of my hands, it would always be as bad. But of
Yeah.
course, you get used to that too. You have lots of mechanisms to figure out how to make do and come around. You rationalize, you come up with ways to be grateful for other things. And you wind up not feeling as sad as you think. And so basically, what this work shows us is that our circumstances don't really matter as much as we think for happiness. And also that we're just much more resilient than we assume. The worst possible thing could happen to you. And most people, when they're interviewed about that, will say, I wasn't happy that it happened, but at least some good came from it. And
Yeah.
sometimes even more good than bad came from that terrible event. I learned something. I became stronger over time, and so on.
It's interesting. You're talking exactly almost what 7, 8 months after a massive fire here in Los Angeles, and I think you probably know all about that. You were here afterwards. I
Yeah.
know that, and so I have a lot of people in my practice who were actually directly affected. They lost their home or they were moved for whatever reason, and I mean that's a big deal when you lose your house because you
Yeah.
walk out of the door and you lose the pictures on the wall, your all of your picture, your photographs, and I mean so
Yeah.
much you lose in a day. It's interesting to actually, now that they're coming in afterwards, I go, "How are you doing?" And they go, "You know what? We're fine. We're fine. We're
hmm
we're we're working it out. We're figuring it out." I think you're right. I think the resilience of human beings is really something phenomenal.
hmm
And I mean, there were people during World War II who were taking shelter in London when they had air raids. I mean, they would go down to the underground and they would come out of the underground and they would carry on their lives. And you kind of
Yeah.
go, are you, they were functioning quite well, actually. Um, and so I do think that we as human beings have an ability to adapt to whatever we have. Certainly the people who went through the horrific fires, and they were
hmm
horrific, let me tell
Yeah.
you. Um, they are working their way through it. I'm not saying everybody is like super happy because they're still working
Yeah.
through all the hassles of insurance. I think insurance companies make people unhappy in
Yeah.
general. Have you
Yeah.
figured that out? I mean, if we, I think your cure to unhappiness is getting rid of all insurance companies and all lawyers and maybe I don't know what politicians do, throw them in. That might help, but I do think that I like what you say in terms of the ability of human beings to adjust and carry on with their life.
hmm
Um, we haven't talked about spirituality, and I'm curious to know what your research has shown people who have a deep faith. Tell us a little bit about that because I do. My observation is that people I'm talking about adults now who have faith, generally speaking, are more upbeat or happier people. I also think people who have a ongoing relationship, people who are married, I think that reduces loneliness and possibly having a married partner helps you to get out of the loneliness trap because the loneliness is a big issue in this nation. But can you speak to those issues? Maybe spirituality initially.
Yeah, yeah. So this is something that researchers have looked at a lot, right? Are religious people happier? And they've found something kind of curious. First, yes, it is the case that people who are religious are happier, but it tends to be more the people who engage in religious behaviors, like so people who go to services, go to church, engage in prayer, and so on, rather than just the people who have religious beliefs. So believe in God or a higher power or something like that. And the distinction, I think, is that it gets back to something we were talking about before, that happiness is this active process, right? It's about your
Yeah,
behaviors and mindsets. And so if you think about the behaviors and mindsets of people who are kind of acting on their faith, they're probably going to church and getting some social connection, probably participating in charity, probably engaging in a mindset practice of being a little bit more present, whether that's through meditation or prayer or so on. A lot
yeah,
of individuals, a lot of spiritual practices, we talked about saying grace, have a practice that's about expressing gratitude for things, right? And so it seems like it's not necessarily our beliefs, like having a belief in a God who's benevolent, who's taking care of you. It seems like it's really about practices. And I think that is good news for people who might not be people of faith, right? Think of an atheist or so on. The idea is that, well, those behaviors and mindsets are open to you. You just might need to be a little bit more intentional about going about getting them, right? But for sure, religious individuals definitely happier. And it's in part because they're engaging in a lot of the behaviors and mindsets that we know naturally kind of boost happiness. In terms of marriage, I think the relationship is a little bit more complicated, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, Marriage is one of the things that we tend to get used to. There are lots of data showing what's called hedonic adaptation for marriage. So this is just this practice of getting used to it. You kind of adapt hedonically in terms of your pleasure to something. And so, unfortunately, often the happiest people report being married is like, the first year they're married, and then it kind of goes downhill over time. But the good news is there are practices we can do to kind of get back the happiness that we, had initially at the start of our marriage. And a big one gets back to something we talked about before, which is gratitude.
Yeah.
Spousal gratitude is one of the biggest predictors of a happy marriage. So if you haven't thanked your spouse in a while, for whatever it is, emptying the dishwasher, getting that, late night nanny, just like helping out and being them, express that gratitude, because expressing it publicly is a really great way to boost marital satisfaction.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's true. I mean, marriage is complicated. Actually, it's complicated when you have children.
Hmm.
What is the research show uh, that happens in marriages when children are born?
Yeah, it's not great. Like spousal happiness tends to go down with the first kid, goes down even further after the second kid, and there's a real spike down for the third kid. So my students see these data and they're like, definitely no third kid. I think is what they unfortunately take away from it. But I think again, these patterns are based on the kind of behaviors and mindsets that people tend to bring to these processes, right? It might be harder to intentionally, express spousal gratitude, find ways to kind of connect with your partner, find ways to have social connection outside the family when you have more and more kids, right? But it's possible to do so, right? Especially if you're prioritizing the kinds of stuff that really does move the needle in terms of your well-being.
Yeah. You're talking to a third child here, Laurie. So
Sorry,
you're
sorry.
kind of hitting
Hitting
below
a nerve, yeah.
you're hitting below the belt here. Well, my wife and I actually did have two sets of three. I happen to be a firm believer that the third child is actually a very special child because I'm a third child. So I
Hmm.
have to support my number in the family here. But we had two third children. We had one, two, three, and then another one, two, three. Um, I do think that I don't know. I mean, do you have any research on families who have big families? Like,
Hmm.
is that help you? I mean, after you get the third child, which if it goes down, does your spousal appreciation or marital bliss go up after the fourth or fifth child, or does it just keep going down?
I think it like that's like the third kid plus is kind of, it sort of stays. It doesn't dip further after the third kid. So that's
Okay.
good. Maybe you figured that out in your own family. But no, I mean, I think what's important to remember is these things are averages, right? We're looking at a big bell curve distribution around people's happiness after these events. And I think the
Right.
key to my research is it's telling you there's lots of stuff you can do to make these things better or make these things worse, right? And that really it's under our control no matter what situation we're in to make it better or worse.
So what about just having children in general? Are people who have children happier or less happy?
Yeah, it's a complicated question. It gets to that kind of this definition of happiness that I started with in the beginning, right? Kind of happy in
Yeah.
your life and happy with your life. If you ask people with kids, do you have a high sense of purpose? Are you really happy with your life? People often self-report yes, maybe even more so than people without kids, and they often point to their kids to point to that sense of purpose, right?
Yeah.
But if you
Yeah.
look at people's kind of moment to moment happiness, a lot of times what you find is that people with kids see more negative emotions than people without kids, right? There's more frustration and kind of anxiety and fear and these kinds of things. And so it tends to be a complicated pattern. The researcher Jennifer Senior, who has a book about this stuff, refers to this as all joy and no fun, right? Where it's like, you have this big kind of sense of purpose, the kids give great joy in my life, but in practice, it's less fun. It's dirty diapers. It's kind of discipline. It's, feeling the guilt and the frustration and all the stuff we talked about. And that's
Yeah.
why I think these strategies can be so profound for parents, why the former Surgeon General had a whole global kind of health advisory. These are the kinds of things he does about like the smoking crisis or the obesity crisis or the fentanyl addiction. He actually put out a health crisis on parents are under stress, right? I think to call attention to this, to say, hey, in the trenches, this can feel kind of hard. Common
Yeah.
humanity, that makes sense. It is tough to be a parent right now, but here are some strategies you can do to feel better. And here are some, things that we as a society should be thinking about doing better to kind of ease parents' burdens as well.
Yeah. 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 I think that I harken back a lot of times to the old days where people had multiple you had grandparents, you had
Hmm.
uncles and aunts, and everybody kind of lived in this little shtetl, this little community, which we don't have. I
Yeah.
mean, our children are cast to the wind, if you will, and parents, grandparents are separated from their grandchildren, and siblings are separated. Can you? This is the modern world we live in. Can you speak to that? Do you find that groups of people who tend to continue to cluster? I'm not even sure where you find this, where you would even compare where this would be happening, maybe in other more different areas of the world. But any thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, I think, whenever you see more social connection, you tend to see more happiness. We see this, as I mentioned, from some of the cross-cultural studies where the US, I think, where people are isolating more, as you mentioned, grandparents aren't living nearby and so on, much less happy than places that have these bigger familial communities, right?
Yeah,
But I think we see this even really locally in the small things that we do. One of the World Happiness Report has this one kind of chapter on the happiest countries, but they have all these other chapters, just different research on happiness that they do each year. And one of the chapters this year was on the power of shared meals, where they looked across countries and even within the U.S. at how many shared meals people were having. If you assume, breakfast, who knows, but like if you take lunch and dinner, the max could be say 14 shared meals that you could have across the week. How many were people having? And they were finding that, the mode in the US tends to be around like one or zero, or like some people are having like no shared meals whatsoever. But the more you have, kind of the higher your happiness. And so I think that gets to basically the point that you're making, right? Is that like what we want to do is be promoting community and collegiality as much as we can. And I think around the dinner table too, right? And I think we want to do
yeah,
that as individuals, but we also want to promote, societal practices that help us do that too.
yeah, I agree. It's a big deal. I tell all my parents to eat together, eat with their
Hmm.
children. That's one of my little things I tell people all the time. I'm watching our time. I have one last thought, and that is that when you go to Europe, you look at these old areas of Europe, and the streets are narrow. There are people are kind of all together,
Hmm.
Italy or wherever you want to go. And you look at our modern world. You look Los Angeles. Everybody lives away from each other. There, you
Hmm.
have to drive to do anything. You have to drive to, to get a loaf of bread, and you can't walk down to the corner store anymore. How in America, and we talk about this loneliness phenomenon. It seems like we're all in these little boxes, even in neighborhoods. In my neighborhood, for example, no one knows each other really. I have to
Hmm.
be honest with you, and it is so isolating, just because of the way we live.
Yeah.
Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that researchers have looked at a lot too, right? If you look at some of the countries in the World Happiness Report, but also cities in the United States that tend to be happier, they tend to be ones with higher walking scores, which gets back to the point about exercise that we talked about earlier. But they're also
Yeah,
ones that tend to have more shared spaces, right? More parks, more spots where people can kind of see other people and potentially get together. And we've known this for a long time. The political scientist Robert Putnam did some famous work on what he called third spaces. So these are
yeah,
a place that's not home or not work where you can get together with somebody else, whether that's a park or a barber shop or, Cheers is the classic example from the TV
yeah,
show. Maybe
yeah,
a bar is not a great, the place where everybody knows your name is the idea. And what he found, even when he was doing this work back in 2000, is that those third spaces are going away, definitely since like the 1950s and so on. And I think it's gotten even worse. And so the kind of public policy recommendation is that we should be finding ways to build more of these spaces in, right? Could LA set up some spaces where people get together, public parks and so on? Could we allow for walking and biking paths, not just the big freeways where people can really see one another and connect? Those are things that our governments can be doing that we know from the research will really promote well-being and promote other healthy behaviors as well.
Yeah, no, I completely concur. Bowling Alone with Robert Putnam's
Yeah.
book. It's a great book. I read it many years ago, and I have to tell you, it had a big impact on me. Well, listen, I'm watching our time. I promised you we would be out within an hour. I'm going to be true to my promise. Dr. Laurie Santos, you're a blessing. You really are.
Thank
You
you.
are a treasure to the people there at Yale and to many other people. Again, Laurie is a Chandrika and Ranjan Tandon Professor of Psychology back there at Yale. She has a podcast too, by the way. Her podcast is called The Happiness Lab. Her podcast is probably better than my podcast. I hate to say that, but I think it's probably true because you are extremely fluent in the literature, dear. I'm impressed by you. Just got to pull those little literature right out of the air, which is God bless you for that. You know your stuff. So thank you, Laurie, for being on the Hamilton Review today.
Thanks so much for having me on the show.
You're a treat, and if you ever come to California, I'd love to see you.
Nice.
So, friends, you have been listening to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. Thank you very much for tuning in to this conversation with Dr. Santos. And until next time, be well. Bye-bye.
You have been listening to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. Thank you for allowing us to be a part of your day. Tune in again next week on Apple Podcast. Rate and comment and tell a friend.